Thank you so much, Jonna. Um, Before we get started, I just want to give a little background on how this began and um, how we have the amazing, incredible Lou with us. And part of that came from organizing a chainsaw workshop, skill building workshop together. And I was facilitating and Lou was leading. So um, I was completely blown away at the amount of knowledge and skill that they were able to speak to while also being just incredibly generous and kind. Their their speaking abilities, I was like, I'll follow you anywhere. And also I want to learn so much more. So I just felt like it'd be better to try and share that knowledge and get Lou out here to talk more. Um, so yeah, I'm a big fan of Lou and just so grateful to know them. And I'm gonna pass it over to you, Lou.
Wow, thank you so much for your kind and flattering words. I feel like I also have some thanks in order as well too. I'm super appreciative that the Indigenous lens has already been mentioned today because we are essentially as settlers working the land and managing the land, relearning everything that was already discovered by Indigenous people about co-management with fire on these lands. I also want to thank all of you for being here because I very adamantly believe that working lands are going to be one of our biggest allies in conservation, despite some paradigms and despite some other production strategies that may not be super conducive, like factory farming, to our ultimate climate mission. So I thank you guys for the work that you do, for showing up every day and, getting it done little by little, steady day by day. And I hope to match your energy out in my fields work. But without further ado, that sort of leads me to my intro slide. Who the hell am I? Um, I am Lubine. I use they, them pronouns. I am a fire practitioner. I do a lot of work in riparian restoration and in fuels management and forestry. But I also do sometimes suppress wildfires as well. Suppression is still part of our landscape of our relationship with fire in our human-built communities. So I want to share some different, wide-ranging knowledge on um, improving your own relationship with fire in your landscape. And of course, I won't be able to speak to everybody's landscape in particular, but I'll leave plenty of time to um, ask questions at the end. And if I don't know the answer, maybe I'll know some resources to point you towards for your region. Every region has a very different relationship with fire. Um, so you can go on to the next slide. Sweet. So just so it doesn't seem like I'm like, got a conspiracy board with like all these different like crazy topics and like how they fit together. I did just want to give everyone kind of a rundown of what we're going to talk about today. First, I kind of want to take you guys through fire boot camp. How does fire as a chemical reaction work? A lot of people think that fire is a super chaotic force. And it does have its own chaotic beauty to it for sure. But it is also a science and it has a behavior that we can understand. And that understanding is fundamental to then understanding how we can improve our relationship with fire as people who work the land, who are land managers. Then I'll go into identifying some hazards around like your particular property and what you can do to mitigate those risks. And then sort of move into using fire as a tool again. Like, I don't want this to be the typical, like, presentation that you might get from your local county fire where they're like, fire bad. We're going to try to remove fire from landscape. We're going to exclusively suppress. And then I also want to bring in that watershed element too, because it's an underlooked aspect of wildland fire. Fire has a huge impact, especially post-fire, on our watersheds. And our water is obviously critically important, especially those of us living in the West right now. You can go to the next slide. Sweet. All right. So, like I said, fire is a chemical reaction, and if any of the ingredients of the reaction are missing, then the fire will not be able to form. So, we'll kind of dive into what these three things are. You may already know this, but we'll crash course it anyways. So, you can go to the next slide. If we kind of think of fire, like as being like a little tent, these are our tent stakes. And if we lose any stake of the tent, then the whole thing collapses. So fuels are one of the most important pieces, of course. Fuels are anything that can burn, leaves, bark, grass, limbs, trunks, your house, your animals, all of these things, unfortunately, when we're looking at fire as a chemical reaction, are all considered the fuels that are available to burn in a fire. Next slide. Oxygen is really important. It's all around us in the outdoors in the air that we breathe. And so this can be one of the more difficult things to contend with because, of course, we can't really smother outdoor fires the way that we might with an indoor fire, like a kitchen fire. Next slide. And then heat. And heat can come from nature or it can come from humans. About 99% of fires are started by something related to human ignition sources. And sometimes these are obvious ones like arson, fireworks, things like that. But they can also come from more unlikely sources like dragging chains behind your car that are accidentally starting sparks on the ground, or even using powered tools that can let off sparks if used incorrectly. Next slide. Yeah, so these are just kind of some examples. Obviously, most of us are not super concerned about lava on the mainland here, but lightning starts are going to be our main natural source of ignition. Next slide. Cool. And so even the wildfire like kills plants, and from a superficial level, it can look super destructive. Its effect on the whole ecosystem is not all bad, and that's sort of one of those overarching themes I want to take through this whole talk today. We can think of wildfire as sort of a speedy recycling system that helps renew the areas that it happens in. Next slide. Cool. All right. So now that we know the chemical reaction triangle of fire, there's one more fire triangle that firefighters learn. And this is how we sort of assess an area for safety when it comes to fire. So we can predict the way that fire behaves, even though, like I said, it seems sort of chaotic. And this is based on a variety of different factors, looking at the weather, looking at the land, and looking around at the fuel. So next slide. You can sort of think about this in application to your own property, the place that you live, the place that you manage. When a wildland fire walks into a situation that they're sizing up to see potential for growth of a fire or management of a fire, that's what they're looking at. But you can think about your landscape as like preemptively, like what if there was a fire here, identifying some of the risks to your specific property. So slope, unlike us humans, the only thing that runs faster uphill than downhill is bears and fire. And that's purely just because as that heat rises, it sort of pre-ignites. All the fuels above it are off-gassing and basically like starting to cook up and dry out and be available for that fire to continue to run uphill. So if your property is uphill, that's a risk to consider. And then the aspect as well, south and west aspects are drier than north and east facing slopes just because of the sun and whatnot. Next slide. So yeah, unlike you and me, fire runs faster uphill. And something that we see really commonly with fire behavior, like I said, that fire runs up the side of the hill and then it'll throw embers off onto the other side. Something to consider as well too is that most pieces of like values at risk, whether that be your home, structures, fences, even all of those things, actually in our research of the impacts of fire on human property, they tend to be destroyed more often by embers and radiant heat coming off of flaming fronts more than being actually burned over by the fire itself. So it's definitely something to consider. Next slide. All right, after we have looked around at everything going on, or looked down at everything going around us with the terrain, we're going to look around at the fuels that are around us. These are just some things I'll continue to mention, like words wise, but firefighters and fire practitioners refer to things like grasses and even some small shrubs and stuff as fine fuels. And they allow that quick spreading fire that burns very intensely, but it burns very quickly. And then we also have our down fuels, which allow long, intense, hot burns. So not all fires are created equal, and different fires have different impacts on the soil and the habitat around them. A lot of times, those intense, quick spreading fires that stay on the ground are going to provide us the best opportunity for nutrient turnover and provide those really good benefits, even though they look a little bit more intense and flashy. Whereas those down fuels being ignited can actually cause some of the worst impacts because that long smoldering log has more time to sterilize the soil underneath it. Um, and then also, obviously, we know that dead fuel is dry and therefore more dangerous, and live fuel is moist and less dangerous. Next slide. And then weather, of course. And this comes into play in considering not only maybe weather if you are going to implement fire as a tool in your property, but also just being aware of what the prevailing winds and the regular storm winds are in your area, like all the weather patterns, because it can help you plan if there is a catastrophic emergency of wildfire event in your area, knowing being able to sort of predict that fire behavior based on wind patterns in your area. Also to knowing when those happen during the day, because generally most places have um, local winds that follow a pattern. Um, so looking at wind, carries fire, supplies oxygen. That's one of the scariest parts of wind for people who are trying to contain or manage fire. Temperature obviously enables intense burns if it's super hot. And then water. So drought and low humidity, of course, create more dry fuel and more risk to your values and structures on your property. Next. So wildland firefighters' job is to contain and manage fires. For the longest time since the 1910 Big Burn, we have been using a suppression-based approach to wildland fire, but we are slowly trying to get away from that. We are trying to manage more fires for resource benefit purposes. And this kind of comes down to how we approach fire containment. So I think that it's important to talk about this cool tactic because it's something that you can do on your property before a fire even happens. So you can go to the next slide. And all those were super cool videos from a very awesome, huge 500-acre prescribed burn that I was able to participate in Forest Service. It was freaking awesome to see that much fire reintroduce the landscape. But anyways, this part is going to be a little bit participatory. So if you want to raise your hand, I don't know if I'll be able to see it, but whoever, I think Zara, since you're the host, maybe you can call on somebody for me. But if we are trying to protect the light tan section, let's say that's our little town of Forest Glen, from the wildfire on the mountain nearby, um, firefighters try to use existing features like rivers and roads to contain fires. So does anybody have an idea using some of the things that are already on the map? If I'm going to send this hand crew out there to go dig that line by hand, where would be like the most advantageous place for me to go cut in additional line to protect from that fire spreading to our city? Does anyone have an idea? Well, that's totally fine. I can, does someone, wait, is there someone? Totally. So someone said in the chat, like the Forest Service Road is a good holding feature to use. And the lake and the river are also great things to tie into. So yep, somebody said in the chat, connecting the road to the meadow is absolutely a great option for putting in our resources and the time that we have into creating the best possible circumstance for protecting our values at risk and our property and our structures. So this is something that can absolutely be applied to your property. If you can identify some things that you already have on your property, all of us like have some sort of road to access, probably, unless you're crazy and you hike or bike into your house. And then a lot of us have a lot of different like water sources near our land as well, that can be used. So consider, digging in a small trail. As you can see, like wildland firefighters generally only actually have to cut in about a foot wide trail, in order to create enough of a fuel break to slow that fire down, slow that flaming front down. Next slide. Yeah, so there's the answer. Next slide. Sweet. All right. So that's sort of containing a large area, right? But one of the other things that we can do to protect our structures and our homes on our properties is thinking about the home ignition zone. And you may have heard this before if you've ever spoken with your county fire. We'll go through it very quickly. I also have all of this in like a trifold guide, the QR code for my website, that has a bunch of different resources and a digital exhibit about fire ecology if you're interested. All that is on there. If you're like, whoa, that was a lot of information. I need to review it. I need to look at it again. And there also is on that trifold a checklist so you can go through and make sure that you have your little fire mitigation chores sorted out for yourself. Um, but some aspects of our houses are hard to change. So that could include building materials, placement of the structure, the surrounding terrain around our house. Like we're saying, that slope, that aspect can have a huge effect on how much risk your house has, and the fuel type that you live in. And fuel type just being a fancy way of like what ecosystem, what habitat, what kinds of trees and plants are growing around you. But mitigation can help control that fire behavior before it approaches your house. So basically, what we're trying to do is like slow that flaming front. Like I said, the radiant heat and the embers are what we're really worried about. So if we can slow and bring down the intensity of the fire behavior as it approaches the house, that's exactly what we want. That's the most amount of control that we have as humans. Next slide. Sweet. Zone one prevents flames and embers from coming into direct contact with the house. This is the one that costs the least amount of money usually and is so easy to do, but a lot of people forget this step and they do all the big flashy stuff in zone two and zone three. And then, oh, you got leaf litter in your gutters and, now your house is on fire. So this is one that's like super, super critical and generally actually the easiest and cheapest to do. So that includes clearing leaf litter out of those gutters, cleaning those gutters out. Leaf litter can also collect in, like, if you have a lot of folds in the roof of your house, and eaves. You need to remove all objects and firewood from being up in contact with that house in that 5 foot zone. You can solve stuff pretty close to your door if you have a wood burning stove and you need to grab firewood, just 5 feet away from the actual house itself. Replace mulch with maybe rocks or something of that nature that is unflammable. And remove any shrubs or trees. This is such a hard one because it's very difficult to part with our precious trees and shrubs around our house, but it is one of the biggest impacts that you can make on your property, especially if they are trees that have a short life cycle or a prolonged rotting period of death. Those things can really put our homes that we care about at risk. Next slide. Zone two decreases, like I said, that intensity by removing fuel. This means like keeping grasses under 5 inches, creating 10 feet of crown spacing between trees, breaking up clumps of trees, removing ladder fuels. So like usually it depends on the tree species, but making sure that like if you can see your grass and you can see where the first limbs of the trees start, removing any of those limbs so that there's less of a chance that it'll jump into those trees and torch the tree. And then removing any dead trees or shrubs. Next slide. Sweet. And then zone three keeps fire low to the ground by promoting a healthy forest ecosystem, and a healthy density and a healthy age, healthy ages within your stand. So you want to promote a variety of species and ages, remove those ladder fuels again, from those lower lying grasses and shrubs, and then create a mosaic of meadows and trees. And again, this is one of those ones that's very dependent on your region. I would definitely recommend talking to a forester in your particular area. If you have a state forest office in your area or a National Forest Service office, they generally will have resources to give you specific to the fuel type that your house is in and how to promote that healthy forest or grassland area that is near your home. And I will say too, like people oftentimes have a hard time with the aspects of this that maybe don't seem exactly like what you would do on a habitat restoration project. But the thing I encourage people with is you already live here. So the house and your structures being there is already a disturbance on that landscape. What we're trying to do is make sure that fire can do its thing on the landscape around your disturbed area that you're managing and creating value for yourself and your family from. So that we can bring fire back into relationship, but also protect the things that are important to you. Next. Totally. And then, driveways are also important too. You need to get in and out of your house, and a firefighter may need to get in and out of your house as well too at any given time. So just use that same HIZ checklist, especially that zone 1, zone 2, to remove fuel around driveways to create an escape route. With this too, I always like to mention, like, you practice or you perform like you practice for sure. So make sure to establish an evacuation plan and a safe meetup spot for livestock, pets, members of the household. Especially that evacuation plan for livestock and pets can be really complicated. Having the kinds of medications that the humans and animals in your house need to be healthy for long periods of time, having enough food to bring with you as well, and emergency supplies. So keep all those things in mind too when you're preparing your property for wildfire. Make sure that you have an emergency evacuation plan, and that'll go for anything, whatever goes on in your area. Tornado, hurricane, wildfire, all of it. It's always good to have a go plan. Next slide. Sweet. So now I told you that you need to remove ladder fuel, and I really want to get specific in this workshop on some actionable items that you can do, yourself or with the help of your neighbors. You can remove the dead and lower limbs, like I said, like on some of those like larger trees, especially deciduous ones, or some of our larger conifer species. Removing that first 15 feet is kind of that sweet spot, but definitely not true of all tree species. So double check with a forester in your area or do a little Googling. Um, Creating 10 plus feet of crown spacing is really important in that like area that's right up near your house in that zone 2 area. And then remove small trees and shrubs under mature trees. Those are again acting as that ladder into the tree. And then cutting tall grasses down a little bit so that they're not reaching that ladder fuel. You can still, obviously, I love tall grasses and I love promoting native biodiversity in grasses. But yeah, making sure that there's a little bit of space between the last branch and the top of the grass. Next slide. This is another fun one that's really popular all over the country that's worth considering if you know somebody who has goats or you have goats yourself. But goats can be an absolute secret weapon in your fire mitigation arsenal. And you can identify areas of hazard using that look up, look down, look around that we talked about earlier, or excessive fuel loading. So just like really freaking overgrown. And then you can do targeted grazing of those areas for low-lying branches and tall grasses that carry fire. Sheep and cattle will also do these types of things, but they generally like won't eat those branches that are low-lying, and the goats will they don't care. So there are some awesome videos of that on YouTube that I absolutely love watching, and I hope to use this at some point in my career. I'm very excited about this and haven't done it myself, but definitely look into this if you have goats or know someone with goats, as far as using this as a tool in your arsenal. Next slide. And then when you do go to limb the trees, it's also really important that we keep our trees healthy, because a dead tree is going to be a dry tree that's standing in our forest waiting to ignite, should the opportunity present itself. So you want to basically think about relieving the weight of the branch to avoid cracking on the actual trunk of the tree itself. And then cutting above the growth collar creates the smallest surface area of the wound. And again, if you're going to do this task, you're probably not going to remember everything we talked about on the Zoom call. So make sure to check out the trifold, and that will have information on how to limb for tree health as well. So next slide. Cool. So one of the things too, as you're cutting things off and doing disposal, you need to think about before you even begin, what am I going to do with all this fuel? Because if you just leave it on the ground, exactly where you cut it off, you're not really doing all that much mitigation, right? There are, of course, lots of different options available to us that are pretty easy to figure out, like taking slash trailer to the dump with you. Chipping is often available through your county fire department or just like different county nonprofits and things. So look into that as well. But pile burning is also absolutely an option. I also have a step-by-step guide on the site as well too, if you're interested in learning how to build good piles that will collapse and get rid of your fuel while also being safe. Um, but yeah, so as you're doing your limbing exercises, you're just going to want to look for a bare, flat area with very little vegetation, free of roots or stumps, because you can actually have a fire, like a zombie fire underground if you catch stumps or roots on fire. And then just distance from like what we call drip lines. If you can look up and in the area of your radiant heat that's going to come off of your fire, there's trees or limbs of trees hanging over that area, probably not a good spot to build a pile. The other thing I like to mention too, building a nice gumdrop shape with the natural curvature of branches works awesome. It starts to kind of collapse on its own and takes the least amount of effort, especially if you're burning a lot of piles at once. You also want to avoid compaction because you like, we talked about the chemical reaction, you need that oxygen in the fire to make it go. So you want to avoid compaction of the pile. Putting the butt ends on the ground of the stems also means that you're less likely to have one fall in a weird direction and start a fire outside of where your pile is intended to be. And then putting those large fuels on the bottom, so those will be the last to burn. You'll have to monitor those for a while because they'll take longer to burn. And then I kind of hinted at this earlier, but you don't really want to put anything larger than your wrist into the pile because if we burn those logs, we risk sterilizing the soil underneath. So you can go to the next slide. Of course, wear proper PPE, keep a rake or a shovel with you so that you can kind of manage it, and avoid burning with kerosene or gas. Opt for a mix of fuel, and there's more information online if you want to know what that exact fuel ratio is that's actually safe. Um, but if you can just ignite it on its own, it's better for your own lung impact to burn piles if you can just get them to start on their own. And never, 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 never leave your pile unattended. It's a great way to get in a ton of trouble and also potentially just screw yourself over by burning something that you care about. But a well-constructed pile should collapse in on itself as it burns. But you can just kind of help chunk it in, and then continue to burn and monitor the pile until you have small coals that are still black, avoiding sterilizing the soil underneath by burning it down to ash, which you'll start to notice that it will turn white. And that's when you're starting to sterilize that soil. But if the pile is too hot to touch with the back of your hand, then it is too hot to leave. Next slide. And then this is where weather comes back in again too. Also, like I hinted at earlier, avoid burning when there is an inversion layer, which is basically just like a fancy way of saying that all that smoke is going to be kept down towards the ground. If there's like a storm rolling in, generally that means there's going to be an inversion layer. There's also fire weather available through NOAA. And that's a great one to check as well too. That will give you pretty clear instructions on whether this is a good time to burn, not only for fire behavior, but also for your own lung impact and your community's lung impact. Again, understanding your wind directions, how wind normally changes, because whatever the wind's doing right now, maybe your wind always shifts from a different direction at 1 o'clock. You need to know that before you burn. And then never burn in gusty or erratic conditions, especially if your county has put in a burn ban, which should be obvious, but bears mentioning. And then do not burn when the relative humidity is low. It's best to burn when piles are surrounded by snow. So this can be an awesome winter activity. You take your breakfast burrito out there in your tinfoil, you stick it in there, you hang out by your fire all day. And it's kind of a cozy winter activity, I think. But yeah, always check local regulations and restrictions. Next slide. Sweet. So yeah, controlled burning in general, even outside of pile burning, if you are prescribed burn curious, is a tool that can absolutely enrich the soil. And that's something that anybody who cares about forage on their landscape, obviously cares a lot about. The natural fire regime of the plains, where many of our contemporary crop and grazing lands reside today, were at one point historically characterized by frequent, fast burning, low intensity fires, primarily only affecting that O and A horizon of the soil. Next slide. So even though the total nutrient pool is decreased by burns, the soil fertility and mineralization increases because nutrients that are bound up in that decaying matter become more readily available to our plants. Fires also generally increase soil turnover and redistribute nutrients throughout the ecosystem. And I've included a couple different references to some really interesting research as well too throughout this section of the presentation. Next. And this is just kind of the main nutrients that are impacted by things like prescribed burning, those low intensity creeping ground fires. Next. Cool. Low intensity burns also produce a layer of charcoal or black carbon on the O horizon of the soil that enhance the uptake of nitrogen by crops and native grasses. And this charcoal can also prevent nutrient leaching, which increases porosity and promotes root growth, and increases drainage and aeration of the soil. Another, some of this is just a product of a really quality, well done burn. But a lot of people also too are purchasing things like air curtain burners and creating natural like ovens to do biochar as well too, which you may have heard of, and it's a great thing to look into as well for a disposal method for your slash. Next. And then I just want to touch on a couple different other benefits of using fire as a tool in your landscape. Immediately following a fire, there is generally a significant decrease in the abundance of microbes in the soil. However, based on a study of the products of the microbial processes, such as CO2 and methane output, research has shown that microbe productivity remains higher than pre-fire averages for over a year after the burn. And this is particularly true of anything native. So as I talk about microbes and invertebrates, and all of those things, like it's certainly true of all of those things that live in our soil that were here before we were, right? Those things that have had a coevolution with fire in our plains regions. Next. So like I said, invertebrates are also absolutely part of this. Invertebrates are sensitive to changes in soil moisture and nutrient content. So those fires do impact the invertebrate community structures, but the natural fire regime of grassland ecosystems is crucial for maintaining that native biodiversity of invertebrates. For example, regular low intensity burns can cull populations of non-native earthworms, while populations of fire-adapted native earthworms will increase in abundance and productivity after fires. And that's just that particular research that I'm citing, but they've also found this as well in other invertebrates that have been studied as far as keeping that balance of natives and non-natives. And it also goes for our larger wildlife as well, too. Next slide. And then roots and root fungi. Root associated fungi survive on decaying organic matter of grasslands, which of course, when we're burning, that total organic matter is reduced by a fire, and it can lead to temporary population loss. But the fungi living in fire-affected ecosystems are stimulated by fire, again, through that co-evolutionary relationship, and their non-native competitors are culled out by fire events, letting them have the upper hand again. So this is important for maintaining grassland structures, especially really good native forage, because fungi shape the vegetation dynamics and the disturbance responses of every other plant around them. Next slide. And then, like I said, that watershed response is an underappreciated part of our risks when it comes to wildfire. They create an enormous concern for negative impacts to water systems because of the increased risk of soil erosion. And this is particularly not necessarily after those burns that maybe we're choosing to do, that prescribed burning, but more those catastrophic burns that we are seeing intensify with climate change. And then also too, with the addition of, over 100 years of fire suppression and fuel loading that are creating those really intense burns that are sterilizing the soil, that are nuking the root systems, that are holding the ground in place. Some of the greatest concerns post fire is, oh my gosh, all these things that I care about that I love that have provided for my life and my family are gone from this fire. Oh crap, now there's also a landslide happening. So loss of vegetation cover is really important post-fire, and it's something that we can also mitigate depending on the region that we're in. Um, and this is most characteristic, like I said, of those high intensity burns, and it can really result in the deposition of excess sediment and nutrients in our waterways, especially when we're near a lot of agricultural lands where there may be just excess nutrients from fertilizers and things sitting on top of the soil as well. Next slide. This is also sort of a controversial one. We've been working really hard with the rangers in our area and have found a lot of receptiveness to instead of trying to eradicate beavers, working on beaver co-management strategies. But I could think this slide is best summed up by Wetland Don't Burn. Um, you can see this is for my current job right now. The footage that is showing is a beaver co-management strategy where not only are we allowing beavers to proliferate in this area that is actively grazed on, but we are also putting in low-tech process-based restoration techniques, which basically is a fancy way of saying a bunch of humans going in and building fake beaver dams to bring back that wetland, to restore that historic floodplain, to increase forage for multiple land uses, right? So this is on Forest Service land that has grazing permits, has timber permits, has all of these things, but then also improved habitat for our animals that live in our public lands. But yeah, beavers can be a free land manager to you. They can be a little fickle because you can't have a meeting with them and sit down and, tell them your exact strategies. But they're a great co-manager if you can figure out how to understand their behavioral patterns in your area and work with them. Because I tell people all the time, like if you're trying to get rid of beavers and it's something that you have like a regular problem with, if you have an area that's really good for beavers, chances are you're just going to keep trapping beaver after beaver after beaver out because they really like your area. But yeah, just wanted to mention that as a side note too, because just like goats, they can be sort of an unexpected ally in your fight to restore your relationship with wildfire on your land. Next slide. No beavers, no problem. This is some examples that I collected on different kinds of structures if you're interested, building different analogs on your land to get harness all of those improved watershed responses that can increase your forage and can really like impact the ground cover, the vegetation cover long term. If you guys are interested more in this, I'd be happy to talk to anybody and I can drop my email in the chat too. A lot of this too in the West, people are very concerned about water rights, but I'm happy to say that there are proven ways to talk with your neighbors and make these types of things work because contrary to popular belief, they don't store water permanently. So you're not affecting the downstream water right holders. But again, I'll drop my email. So if you have more specific questions and are interested in this kind of watershed management that also serves as fire mitigation, would love to talk to you about it. Next slide. Sweet. So everybody's home has a relationship with fire. Think about where your hometown is, the ecosystems that you live in, and if you do have fire around you, what are you hearing about it? How frequently and how intensely is it burning? And if you don't, get curious, find out what that fire regime was like in your region prior to the fire suppression culture that we have now today. Next slide. And of course, always bears mentioning climate change is throwing off an ecosystem's natural fire regime, in addition to that fuel loading from over 100 years of fire suppression. So being aware that those hotter, drier weather conditions make fires more intense and frequent than our ecosystems are adapted for. And this really hinders that recovery process. Next. But yeah, so I am super passionate about fire ecology and helping anybody who is interested in also helping the land repair their relationship with fire, work towards fire resilience in their community, with their neighbors, on their own property. And so the project that I run is called the Blaze Project. Like I said, if you're interested in learning more, the website itself has a digital exhibit talking about fire ecology. I also have several different podcasts I've done interviewing different professionals, and then also like more of an investigative journalism podcast talking about specifically fire management in grasslands. So yeah, so if you're interested, yeah, definitely check that out. And I believe if you go to the next slide, I think the QR code is on the next slide. Yeah, there it is. So I wanted to leave some time for questions. I'm not sure how you guys generally run like a Q&A session on these types of Zoom calls, but yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lou. Oh my gosh. I feel like we need a beaver version of Smokey the Bear.
I totally agree. Canada actually has one, so I think we should just like, be cooperative about it and we should share it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Um, I really appreciate this. I think that maybe the best thing to do is just come off mute if you have, or raise your hand. Um, I have a lot of questions, so I'll open the floor first. Getting a lot of applause. Love to see it. Um, I'd love to hear more about soil sterilization and how long that could last. Because
Yeah,
thinking
um,
about a lot of mattresses neighbors burn around here.
Yeah, I think that this would really depend on your fuel type. Just because like soil is a living thing and like different fuel types have different like co-evolved microbes, invertebrates, fungi in them. So I think that this is also something that can be like you can use like soil amendments and stuff to recover the soil afterwards. I think that the biggest areas where I've seen issues with this, and this was especially too like early on when I was participating in prescribed burn crews, we would burn things in inappropriate areas or let things burn down for too long. For example, we did a huge pile burn that also had a lot of trash in it, like you were saying, had a lot of trash in it on grazing land. But it was a wet meadow that had been, it was grazed only for a couple months a year. And we burnt this huge pile there. And it sterilized the entire area, so there was no more forage for the cattle that had grazed there. And instead, we got algal blooms because that creek was coming in and bringing that water into that wet meadow area, and nothing else could grow there other than the algae. So I think that while I can't give you without like knowing the exact field type, like an amount of time it would take for the soil to recover on its own. It can be solved through like soil amendments and things like that, obviously, and reintroducing some kind of cover, like especially those like first succession, primary succession species of native plants, especially. But yeah, it is like a definitely like a risk I want people to look out for because it's something I don't hear people necessarily discussing when teaching people how to burn piles in particular.
Yeah. Dang. Yeah, I didn't even think about it. I'm glad to know about it now. Are there any other questions? I can keep going, but
Somebody just dropped the Life with Fire podcast episode with Emily Fairfax. And Dr. Emily Fairfax is a researcher on beaver activity and fire in the West. She is my hero. I met her and I could barely even talk to her because I was so starstruck. But I would absolutely recommend listening to that episode. Whoever dropped that in the chat, you're a hero for that, finding that so quickly. But that is definitely, if you're interested in that relationship between beavers and maybe even implementing beaver co-management on your property, that is a great episode to listen to. It'll make a beaver believer out of anybody, I think.
yeah. Lou, in the West, I feel like I've seen a lot of prescribed burns happening. Is that something, do you have advice around that? Just like if someone is interested in that?
Yeah, I think that like my goal today is just to get people curious about how it can be implemented in your area. But of course, there are lots of different things that have nothing to do with the actual land itself or like the steps you take to actually do the burn itself. Sometimes it's the things that happen before, and it's the liability and those pieces that make it so that people um, don't end up using fire as a tool, especially that liability piece is huge. My biggest recommendation is to reach out to your local fire department. Um, there's some amazing things happening in this country right now, as far as implementing new structures to protect people as we experiment with bringing fire back as a tool. This is something that human beings have practiced on this continent for a really long time. It will, of course, be very difficult as the climate changes to do things in the exact same way, but this is a collaborative process. So we should also be able to build capacity amongst each other by helping share liability, share tools. Something really awesome that's happening here in Colorado, we're starting to bring the California model of prescribed burn associations to Colorado. And this helps share that training capacity, that knowledge amongst elders and people who have more experience in fire, maybe even sharing the actual tools to complete the burn itself, the expensive PPE that sometimes people choose to wear, sharing all those things, but then also like collectively even sometimes paying into insurance policies and stuff specific to your community, and like if something does happen with your prescribed burn, because there is an inherent risk to using fire, you are collaborating on like the liability and stuff within that too, and that can really help people open that up as an option. And The other cool thing that's happening specifically in my county is we have when nobody ever stopped using fire here specifically to burn their ditches out for irrigating. And prior to this year, the fire department just knew whose house was going to get out of control, because it was the same people every single year who were like, "Hey, I let my ditch get out of control. You guys want to come put it out?" So instead of that kind of relationship, I was super lucky to be able to participate in the pilot program this year of the firefighters showing up to ditch burns. The farmer is still the person who's in charge of burning their ditch, but the fire department is there with a fire engine to support that ditch burn. So there's so many different creative models, and reframing our relationship with fire is scary and big. It's a big project, but it also allows us to create a new culture and new groups and build community, like help each other out. Like it's sort of like branding in that way, right? Like get your community involved. Fire does not see boundaries between people's property. Fire, you got a fence between you and your neighbor, fire doesn't care. Fire says, I'm gonna burn right over there. So combining your effort with reframing your relationship with fire and mitigating your property with your neighbors and your community can be an amazing way to like make this genuinely be something that seems achievable for you in your community and on your landscape.
Oh my gosh. I could
Also,
listen to you talk.
somebody said in the chat too, oh my gosh, farmers sometimes are faster at responding to wildfires than the actual like firefighters, especially because in some rural areas, it's volunteers who are needing to get from their house to the station. There's a delayed response time, and farmers often have the equipment to get in there with a dozer and like get in there and start, creating indirect line or protecting their neighbors' properties, or even just helping to evacuate loved ones and livestock and stuff. So hats off to farmers for that.
Maybe an ending question, unless someone else has a question. Um, we started, we have a haze right now from smoke, and we've had evacuation orders put in place a couple times. So now we have a list of what we need to grab and like how to evacuate efficiently. I was just wondering if you have any pointers. And like a funny little joke that happens is that we had a neighbor who had a break-in, and she's like, I had my fire list by the door of everything valuable in my house. So we were just joking about that. Like we need to have a good way to anyway, that was just a silly.
Totally. I think
Yeah.
that it is like such a big annoying chore. I like wanna acknowledge that. And it's also really hard to motivate ourselves to do things like that because of the wiring of our brains. It's like, oh, I can't really like imagine something like that happening to me. And like, I'll just keep putting this off. Like maybe I'll do it because I understand why it's important. But I totally get it. Like even though I know the importance of some of these things, I live in a wee community and I drop the ball on some of it sometimes too. But some of the most actionable things that you can do, and this is so boring, but like just taking, even if you can't bring yourself to like make a list and stuff with receipts and everything, which is kind of how insurance companies prefer after a catastrophe happens. And let's say you lose your home or a structure, they would love to see that you have like receipts and like a written spreadsheet or whatever. But even if you just go through your house and you take a picture of everything that you think you would want replaced that could reasonably be replaced by your insurance and just have a photo folder of all of that on your laptop, it's a great place to start if you're just like not feeling super motivated, but you do live in a high risk area. Um, the other things that I just like want to hit home on again, is like having an evacuation plan for animals in addition to your loved ones. And then everybody always forgets to, but just like knowing where your medication is, even if it's just like, oh, I regularly take ibuprofen and stuff like that, like it can be good to have a go bag that has things like that are easy to forget in the heat of the moment because you never know if you are asked to evacuate how long you'll be evacuated. Even just on the 60-acre fire that I was on up here, where it was in a subdivision. It was a fairly small fire, but people were still kept out of their houses for about 5 days because the entire area continued to smolder. You just never know how long you're going to be away from home. So making sure that you're thinking preemptively, what are things that I use on a day-to-day basis that I really couldn't do without?